I want to talk to you because we had J.J. Abrams on the show last night. He's the director of...
At 84, Harrison Ford finally broke the silence he had carried for more than half a century. The man once seen as Hollywood's symbol of loyalty and restraint now speaks of wounds the industry would rather forget. 6 names. 6 people who once stood beside him as allies and walked away as betrayers. His voice is low, gravelly, weighted by time. I don't hate them. He says, I just never forgot. Behind Han Solo's crooked smile, behind Indiana Jones' hat and Rick Deckard's weary stare, there was always a man who paid the price of faith and friendship, in love, and in the very craft that made him a legend. And when those 6 names are finally spoken, the truth cuts deeper than any sword or betrayal on screen. Because in Hollywood, betrayal rarely comes from your enemies. It comes from the ones you once trusted most. Stay until the end. This isn't just his confession about them. It's a story about the man he became because of them. George Lucas, The Price of Legacy. They began as dreamers, 2 young men obsessed with flight, speed, and the illusion of control. In the 1,970 seconds, George Lucas was the quiet visionary, and Harrison Ford, the carpenter who stumbled into destiny. Star Wars made them both immortal. But what began as a shared dream slowly became a quiet, unspoken war between creator and creation. Ford was never meant to be Han Solo forever. He saw the character as temporary, a vessel for something larger. Lucas, however, saw ownership not just of the film, but of everything inside it, including Ford's image, voice, and future. It stopped being art, Ford once muttered years later. It became property. During the filming of The Empire Strikes Back, Ford began pushing back. He wanted depth, flaws, mortality, something human. Lucas wanted myth. Their arguments grew tense. Ford begged for Han Solo to die in the second film. Lucas refused. He couldn't let his creation go. You're not the writer, Lucas told him. You're the pilot. After Return of the Jedi, Ford drifted away. He wasn't invited into the creative circle anymore, not into the special editions, not into the digital remasters that redefined what fans believed Star Wars had been. Each new version edited more than just scenes, it edited memory. Ford's voice, his rawness, his imperfections all were softened by technology. By the 2000s, the relationship had turned into polite distance. Ford appeared in interviews, always respectful, but the warmth was gone. When asked about Lucas, his smile tightened. We built something together, he said. And then he kept rebuilding it without asking. The final blow came in 2012, when Lucas sold Star Wars to Disney. Ford found out like everyone else through the headlines. No call, no note. Decades of shared legacy transferred like a business transaction. For Ford, it wasn't about money. It was about memory, the feeling of being erased from something he had helped define. When The Force Awakens was announced, Lucas wasn't part of it anymore. Ford returned to play Han Solo one last time, but under new management, with new energy. Yet even that moment, his on-screen death felt like an echo of an older argument, finally resolved without words. He always wanted Han to die, Lucas said later, half joking. I guess he got his wish. But Ford didn't smile when asked if it felt like closure. It wasn't closure, he said softly. It was acceptance. There was never a public fallout, no dramatic rupture. Just decades of quiet absence, the kind that hurts more because it's silent. Two men who changed cinema, each unable to forgive the other for wanting to own the same thing, a myth. The friendship that started in a galaxy far, far away ended right here, on Earth in the distance between gratitude and resentment. Somewhere in that space, Ford learned the hardest truth of legacy. The man who helps create your legend can also be the one who rewrites it. Steven Spielberg, The Silent Rift. Harrison Ford and Steven Spielberg were once Hollywood's most dependable duo, the actor who gave weight to fantasy, and the director who turned pulp adventure into myth. Together, they built Indiana Jones, a character who defined an era. But behind the shared laughter, there was always a quiet imbalance. One man owned the vision. The other carried its burden. From Raiders of the Lost Ark to The Last Crusade, Ford gave Spielberg's fantasies a pulse. He performed through pain, broken ribs, and heat stroke. Spielberg called him the best collaborator I've ever had. Ford replied, "Then why do I always feel replaceable?" By the 1,990 seconds, that question began to sting. Spielberg's attention drifted to new obsessions, dinosaurs, war, family. Ford's calls went unanswered. He wasn't being cast aside publicly, but something subtler was happening: silence. Projects once discussed over dinner vanished without explanation. The director who once called him a brother now referred to him as a friend from the old days. When Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull arrived in 2008, Ford felt the difference instantly. The tone had changed. The energy was gone. Spielberg's eyes no longer lit up behind the monitor. During one night shoot, Ford reportedly told a crew member, "He's already somewhere else." The film made money, but it didn't make memories. Critics called it nostalgic, hollow, forced. Ford defended it in public, as he always did. But privately, he admitted to a friend, it felt like Spielberg was saying goodbye without saying it. Years later, Spielberg confirmed it quietly. When asked about returning for another Indiana Jones, he hesitated. "It's time to let go," he said. "It belongs to a new generation." Ford heard that interview while filming Blade Runner 2049. He didn't respond, but those who knew him said he looked wounded, not angry, just tired. When Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny was announced without Spielberg directing, Ford didn't object. He simply nodded. The story would continue, but not the partnership. He created the adventure. Ford said in one interview, "I lived it." Maybe that's where we stopped meeting. What made it hurt wasn't betrayal in the dramatic sense, no argument. No betrayal of trust. It was the slow erosion of connection. Spielberg had moved forward, and Ford had stayed loyal to a myth that no longer existed. For Spielberg, stepping away was artistic evolution. For Ford, it felt like abandonment. They never spoke publicly about it, never accused each other of anything. But at film festivals, when they crossed paths, the distance was visible, respectful, professional, and heartbreakingly polite. It's strange how silence can sound louder than words. They once chased relics and faced danger together. But what they couldn't outrun was time and the quiet acknowledgement that every partnership in Hollywood has an expiration date. Ford still calls Indiana Jones his proudest role. Spielberg still calls him a legend. But they both know that legends, like friendships, fade when the story stops being shared. In the end, there was no fight, no goodbye, just two men walking down different sides of the same road, never looking back. Sometimes the cruelest betrayals don't come with anger. They come with silence. Carrie Fisher, The Emotional Debt. They met on the set of Star Wars in 1976. He was 34. Married. Already cynical about fame, she was 19. Sharp. Fearless. And too honest for Hollywood. The chemistry that audiences saw between Han Solo and Princess Leia wasn't acting. It was something unspoken, burning beneath the lines. For years, it was their secret. Long days, long nights, stolen glances, the kind of silence that says everything. Fisher once called it an affair that never tried to be a story. For Ford, it was a chapter he buried quietly, believing that some things belonged to the past. Then, in 2016, the past came back printed, bound, and sold. The Princess Diarist, Fisher's memoir, revealed what he had never intended to share. The book named him, described the affair, the loneliness, the confusion, the way he made her laugh and disappear at the same time. He was kind, she wrote, but distant like a man living in another world. Ford found out about the book the same way the public did. No warning. No call. Just headlines. When reporters asked him to comment, he said quietly, "It was strange for me." And that was all. Behind that restraint, there was pain not for what was said, but for what it exposed, that even privacy can be betrayed by truth. Fisher didn't intend malice. She was reclaiming her story, her youth, her silence. For her, writing was liberation. For him, it felt like a reopening of something that had already been mourned. She turned our silence into a story, he told a friend. And stories live forever. When Fisher died that same year, Ford attended the memorial alone. He stood in the back, hands clasped, eyes down. No speech, no statement, just presence. Later, when asked what he would say to her if he could, he paused for a long time. "Thank you," he said. "And I am sorry." It wasn't anger he carried, it was weight. The kind that comes from knowing someone once loved you deeply enough to immortalize you, even if it cost your peace. Their bond had always been about opposites, her chaos to his calm, her confession to his silence. And, in the end, she remained the only person who dared to tell the truth about both. In Hollywood, where every secret is currency, Carrie Fisher never cashed in until it no longer mattered. She didn't ruin his image, she revealed his humanity. And maybe that's why it hurt more than any betrayal could. Because what Ford saw as exposure, she saw as closure. And what he thought was forgotten, she turned into legacy. When he speaks of her now, there's no bitterness. Only the quiet respect of a man who knows that love and betrayal sometimes wear the same face. For the world, it was gossip. For him, it was a reminder that even the most private moments can echo louder than fame itself. Sometimes the truth isn't meant to destroy. It's meant to outlive you. Sean Young, The Onset Feud. The set of Blade Runner was cold, not just in tone, but in atmosphere. Los Angeles, 1981. Smoke, neon, and silence between takes. Harrison Ford was the seasoned professional, used to control, precision, and distance. Sean Young was the newcomer, beautiful, ambitious, unpredictable. Their chemistry on screen was undeniable. Off screen, it became something darker. From the beginning, there was tension. Ridley Scott wanted emotional chaos, and he got it. Ford kept to himself. Focused. Terse. Young wanted connection. Conversation. He treated me like I didn't exist. She said years later. Maybe that was his method. Maybe it was personal. Their infamous love scene became the center of controversy. The set was closed. The mood uneasy. Ford's professionalism collided with Young's vulnerability. Decades later, she would describe it as brutal, not in violence, but in the absence of care. Ford never commented publicly, but crew members recalled the silence between them growing heavier with every shoot. When the film wrapped, they went separate ways without a word. Ford buried himself in work. Young carried the memory like a scar. In interviews, she spoke of him with a mix of admiration and bitterness. He was distant, she said, like he wanted to erase me. Ford never responded, not even when her comments made headlines. Silence was his shield and his confession. Years later, when Blade Runner became a cult masterpiece, their story resurfaced. Young, now sidelined by Hollywood, accused both Ford and Scott of betrayal. She said they had ruined her reputation, called her difficult, unstable, uncontrollable. Ford's answer came only once. In a single dry sentence, I wish her well. Those 4 words carried everything: exhaustion, regret, and the quiet finality of someone who had already let go. For Young, Blade Runner was a wound. For Ford, it was a storm he chose never to revisit. When Blade Runner 2049 was announced, she wasn't invited back for the full film. Her likeness was recreated digitally, a younger version of her. Silent. Perfect. Controlled. It was art imitating the pain of being erased. In an interview, Young said, "They used my face, but not my soul." Ford, asked about it, simply nodded and replied, "It was the story." That was all. Some saw it as cruelty, others saw it as detachment, the cost of surviving in an industry that eats its memories. But for Ford, distance was survival. He didn't need to rewrite the past, he just refused to reopen it. Behind the glamour of Blade Runner was a quiet tragedy, 2 actors who mirrored the very characters they played, cold, broken, and desperate to feel something real. Decades later, when asked if Head ever work with her again, Ford said softly, "That movie was enough." It wasn't anger that remained between them, it was emptiness. The kind that lingers after trust collapses. In Hollywood, not every feud ends in noise. Some end in silence, the kind that echoes forever. Ridley Scott, the director's betrayal. Harrison Ford respected directors. He trusted their vision, even when it clashed with his own instincts. But Blade Runner changed that trust forever. Ridley Scott was brilliant, uncompromising, and distant, a perfectionist who believed he was crafting art while everyone else thought they were making a movie. Ford admired him at first. "He's got an eye like no one else." He once said, "But sometimes that eye doesn't see people." The production was chaos, night shoots, exhaustion, rewrites, tempers. Scott demanded hundreds of takes, treating the set like a laboratory and Ford like a variable. Their relationship began to crack quietly, through glances, pauses, and the weight of unspoken resentment. He wanted a machine. Ford later recalled, "But I was human." When Blade Runner finished shooting, Ford thought the worst was over. It wasn't. Months later, he discovered that Scott had re-edited the film, removing scenes, changing tone, and worst of all, adding a voiceover Ford had recorded reluctantly, believing it would never be used. It was like hearing a stranger speak through me. Ford said, "He made me sound dead." The theatrical release bombed. Critics mocked the narration, calling it lifeless and unnecessary. Ford took the blame. Scott said little, only that the studio had demanded changes. The friendship, whatever it had been, dissolved in the static between interviews and headlines. For years, Ford avoided talking about Blade Runner. He loved the story, hated the memory. But in the 1,990 seconds, Scott began releasing new cuts, director's cut, final cut, each one rewriting what the world thought Blade Runner truly was. The narration vanished. The tone darkened. The film was reborn. Scott was celebrated as a misunderstood genius. Ford was barely mentioned. He reclaimed the movie. Ford once told a journalist, "But he erased me in the process." It wasn't anger, it was fatigue. The man who had risked his body and sanity on set was now a footnote to the director's redemption arc. When Blade Runner 2049 arrived, Ford returned under a new director, Denis Villeneuve. Scott was only a producer. They met briefly, polite handshake, short conversation. No apologies, no warmth, just professionalism wrapped in old history. In interviews, Scott called Ford an extraordinary collaborator. Ford called him a brilliant man. Both statements were true, and both were lies. Hollywood celebrated their work as a masterpiece of dystopian art, a vision of man versus machine. But beneath that brilliance lay a very human story of trust broken by ambition. Ford never attacked Scott publicly, never sought revenge. He simply learned, "I stopped believing that art and loyalty could live in the same room." He said once, "One always leaves first." Years later, when asked if he'd ever forgive Scott, Ford smiled faintly and replied, "Forgiveness isn't the point. We made something that outlasted us. That's punishment enough." In the mythology of Blade Runner, the replicants dream of being real. In the mythology of Harrison Ford, he learned that being real sometimes costs more than being remembered. The betrayal wasn't loud or cruel. It was quiet, creative, and permanent, the kind that only happens when vision blinds the human heart. Calista Flockhart, The Quiet Distance. By the time Harrison Ford met Calista Flockhart, he was already an institution, the man who had survived Hollywood's storms and outlived its myths. She was 2 decades younger, fragile-looking but fiercely intelligent, a star of television's golden era. They met in 2002 at the Golden Globes, where laughter filled the air and both were pretending not to care. For Ford, it felt like peace. For a while, their love began as a quiet rebellion against cynicism. He, the stoic veteran, she, the woman unafraid to reach for him when everyone else had stopped trying. "He made me feel safe," she once said. For Ford, safety was a foreign language, something he had never learned to speak. The years passed, and silence grew between them. Ford retreated into his work, into planes, into solitude. He preferred noise. He could control the sound of engines, scripts, tools. Flockhart preferred the sound of live conversations, laughter, the pulse of the ordinary. He could spend days without saying a word. A friend of hers once confessed, she needed warmth. He needed quiet. Their marriage was not built on drama, but on endurance. Yet even endurance erodes when loneliness becomes routine. after his 2015 plane crash. She stayed by his side for months. Patient. Tender. The nurse to a wounded legend. He thanked her in interviews short. Formal. Almost mechanical. She smiled for the cameras, but her eyes told a different story, devotion mixed with fatigue. She loved him deeply, a colleague of hers said, but she also lived next to a man who was always half gone. In private, Ford once admitted, she wanted more words. I gave her silence. It wasn't cruelty, it was habit. Silence had been his survival mechanism since his earliest years in Hollywood, when talking too much meant losing control of the narrative. But in marriage, silence doesn't protect, it isolates. By the 2020 seconds, they appeared together less often. Tabloids speculated, but there was no scandal, no public fracture. Just distance, the quiet kind that settles between two people who still love each other but no longer meet in the same emotional place. Flockhart began teaching, mentoring young actors, reconnecting with the world Ford had left behind. He, meanwhile, prepared for Indiana Jones once again, chasing ghosts on screen while struggling with the ones at home. I don't think he knows how to stop, she told a friend, and I'm tired of waiting for him to land. To the public, they remained married, a serene picture of stability. But insiders describe something more fragile, two people bound by loyalty, separated by silence. He's not unkind, one said. He's just absent. For Ford, the betrayal was unintentional, the betrayal of time, of habit, of emotional gravity. For her, it was the slow realization that love can't thrive where communication dies. When asked once what kept them together, Ford answered, respect. It was the right word, but maybe not the full one, because respect can preserve a marriage, but it cannot warm a home. And in that quiet distance between them, Ford faced his final and most personal betrayal not from another person, but from himself, the man who had outrun villains, directors, and studios couldn't outrun the silence he built around his own heart. 6 names, 6 betrayals, and a lifetime spent learning that even legends are made of fragile flesh and quieter regrets. Harrison Ford never shouted his anger. He never wrote memoirs or sought revenge in interviews. His confessions lived in pauses, in the way his voice drops when a name resurfaces, in the half smile that hides what words cannot. Behind the toughness, there was always a man who understood that loyalty is never guaranteed, even to those who seem unbreakable. George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Carrie Fisher, Sean Young, Ridley Scott, Calista Flockhart, they were not enemies. Not really. They were mirrors. Each one reflected a different fracture, control, ambition, truth, chaos, vision, and silence. Together, they formed the map of his life, a legend built not on victories, but on wounds carried quietly. Ford once said, "The older I get, the less I talk." Maybe that was his peace. Or maybe that was his punishment. In the end, he didn't name them out of hate, but to remember, because forgetting would mean none of it mattered. And for a man who has lived half his life pretending, remembering was his final act of truth.